Hey all, and welcome back to Fuzzy Dirty Gaming and a new Zero to Hero series on the channel, where I take a character from level 1 on a fresh account to hopefully a currency making machine. The goal for this character is to get a really quick character that can farm T16 maps with whatever mechanics you want to put in, invitations and things like that, but I don't want to stretch it to T17s and Uber bosses because I never do that type of content. And if I don't have to stack a ton of damage, it means I can put more things into things like speed and quality of life, where previously if I wanted to push it to Ubers, I'd need to get much more damage. That's not to say we won't push the build that far later on, as I plan to spend a lot of time on the character, but the main aim for this character is just to have some fun. One thing to point out early if you're doing your own Zero to Hero is that the economy is in quite a harsh state for building up new characters. Yes, you can get things really cheap, but that also means that most of the stuff that you find with random idols are going to be worthless. Mechanics aren't really worth doing. Essences is a good example. I bought some Deafening Essences of Wrath in this build, and they cost me 1C each. So things like essences are not really going to be worth it without specific idol setups. And it's the same for a lot of mechanics. There are some things worth currency, and some scarabs are still worth currency that drop fairly often, but overall it's quite difficult to make currency early on if you want to progress your map tiers quickly. I will cover this later on and go over how I'm making my early currency and upgrading my build early on. So the series is going to be quite a detailed step-by-step guide to allow people to follow on if they want to, so it's not going to be short videos covering lots of progress. It's going to be probably longer videos going through each thing I'm doing step by step to allow people, maybe with not as much experience, to follow along. So the build I'm going with is an Infernal Blow Paladin. It's a pretty underused skill, but it is fun and it can scale pretty well. It has a double damage type mechanic on it that helps it out on single target. There's a detailed POB in the description for how I leveled and where the character is now. The build was kind of done on a whim. I was just playing around with the skill and really liked it, so I decided just to jump in. So I don't yet have an endgame POB finalized, so you'll have to keep up with the series if you want to see if the character even works. So before we jump in and start, let's just go over Infernal Blow and how the skill works. So it's a melee strike and AoE skill that puts a charge debuff on enemies that you hit. When that enemy dies, the debuff explodes, dealing AoE damage and pretty good single target damage. It really helps with clear speed on this melee skill. It also works as a boost to single target, as if you hit the same enemy 6 times and they haven't died, the debuff explodes, causing a massive explosion that does around the same damage as what your damage per second of your skill is. So if your skill's doing 8 million damage per second, the explosion will do roughly that amount, maybe a little bit less. Now this works great for chunking enemies' health bars, and also dealing with big hits if you want to stack up things like shock, or you're running Secrets of Suffering and you want to get big brittle or scorch on the enemy. This really helps. It's not the hardest hitting skill in the world, and it can't compete with things like Lightning Strikers. That's just pretty straight up broken for an attack build. But it is a lot of fun and the pops are really satisfying. It's a build where you want as much attack speed as possible, as firstly on this ascendancy you're going to trigger your elemental relics more often, and on single target, you get to your 6 stacks of Infernal Blow quicker to cause those big explosions. So that's enough of me waffling on with the intro. Let's jump into the footage. And as I said, I'm going to explain step by step how I leveled the campaign and how I tackled early maps. I decided to go two-handed swords early on. I did think about dual wielding, but that means I needed to make sure I always had 2 decent weapons. And it makes gearing harder in the campaign, and often it makes the campaign slower. I went Splitting Steel early with Chance of Bleed and Fizz as Fire just because that was the coloured links I had drop. I kept this set up until I was able to get an additional strike from the skill tree, which was around mid to end of Act 2. I then switched to Infernal Blow with a 3-link setup of Infernal Blow, Added Fire and faster attacks. If you follow this, I highly recommend waiting until you get +1 strike. It makes the skill not whiff as much on enemies because it has a very short strike range, and it means you don't have to run Ancestral Core in your links, which really lowers your damage. I then went straight for Precise Technique to get a big damage increase. I concentrated on physical damage early on, as it's much easier to find a weapon with decent physical damage than elemental damage. When I found my first weapon with some elemental damage on it, I used Faustus to respec out of the Fizz nodes and take elemental nodes. Throughout the campaign, respecing with gold is pretty cheap, and it's certainly something I'd recommend doing if you think you can make your build better. Now I did make a couple of big errors in my leveling it in the campaign. The first being that I forgot to remove my Added Fire gem until around Act 9, and I was doing mainly elemental damage for the majority of the campaign, so it meant I was doing much less damage than I should because I could have had a much more efficient support gem. I also didn't make use of Trinity because the first weapon that I had dropped had fire damage. Infernal Blow also converts physical to fire, so it wasn't going to balance, and I just forgot to revisit it later on in the campaign, again till around Act 9. So a lot of the footage that you're seeing throughout the campaign, your damage could be a lot better if you just remember to drop your Fizz's Fire when you no longer do a lot of physical damage, and you get Trinity into the build. Trinity is a huge damage gem for Elemental. It gives you penetration and more elemental damage, and if you can fit it into an elemental attack build, you should always be doing it. Essentially, as long as the weapon you use doesn't have a lot of fire damage, you should be able to balance Trinity just by adding some lightning damage to your jewelry or getting lightning damage on a weapon, and it's something I should have done and totally forgot about. When you come to complete your first lab, I'd recommend being on a 4-link and take Light of Divinity when you completed the labyrinth. Check what transfigured gems are worth currency and aim for those. So if there are 3 red gems that are worth currency, put a red gem into the altar at the end. I didn't get any gems worth currency in any of my labs during the campaign, so I didn't get that nice early chaos increase that I was hoping to get. In regard to gearing up in the campaign, I used the black market for getting sword upgrades and getting my 4-link and later on my 5-link chest. When you hit level 50 plus, 5 links seem to be pretty common with Faustus, so I'd recommend saving all your gold for these upgrades and try for a 5-link around Act 7. An elemental tincture also helps a lot, so keep checking the vendors. One thing to note is that even though multi-strike looks like a big damage increase on POB and on paper, I feel it actually hurts the skill, because the way multi-strike works with the charges is that your 3 hits of multi-strike will only count as 1 charge. So you essentially have to get 18 hits on an enemy before they explode for single target, as opposed to 6 without it. It just takes a lot longer to build that charge up, and it is a big chunk of your single target DPS. It does mean that the skill feels a little clunky without it because your attack speed isn't as fast, but it's something that I did get used to. I've put a detailed POB in the description with gem links and when to respec, as there's quite a few respecs that I did along the way to make sure the build stayed as optimized as possible. Once you complete your second labyrinth, take Elemental Valence. That gets your elemental relics up and running and is a huge DPS boost. For the third lab, you want to take Field Medicine to get better stats from your flask. The flasks I wanted in the campaign were just 2 Quicksilver, a Mana and a Life Flask. Once I got enough Leech to not worry about Mana, I ran a Life Flask, Quicksilver Flask, Granite, Jade, and then a Tincture with elemental damage. If you can, try and roll this to attack speed, but it can cost quite a few of your alterations, so it's more nice to have rather than a necessity, but I would definitely recommend making sure you get a Tincture, and the vendors sell them fairly often. If you drop any Chaos Orbs in the campaign, a Prism Weave Belt gives a really good damage boost early on, and it's something I'd definitely recommend picking up. Last thing is ensure your sword is upgraded every act or 2, as damage can fall off really quickly if you forget about your weapon. If you're doing 2-handed swords, I'd only bother with bases that are 1.4 attacks per second or faster. The slower attack speed bases just don't feel as nice. That's about it for the campaign. It was pretty smooth despite a few deaths from me not paying attention. There's this death, which in the Innocence fight, I thought he could only do the bullet hell in his final phase. Turns out I was wrong, but I've never had him do it in the second phase or first phase, and I just wasn't paying attention and died. I also had 2 cat-related deaths where they both jumped on my desk to fight each other, so I had to split them up, and by the time I came back, I was dead. But now that the campaign's done, I can start the real grind of map completion with no Atlas tree, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So the character was already ample good enough to start blitzing through maps, but I thought I might as well upgrade some gear now since it will save me having to break to do it later on. First thing I wanted to do was get a better weapon, so I went on the currency exchange and Deafening Essences of Wrath were 1C each. So I bought 5 of those, rolled it, got big cold damage, big lightning damage. This will do me until I decide on my actual big upgrade. After a few maps, I'd accumulated about 20k gold, so I decided to use the black market to upgrade the rest of my gear, rather than spending the limited currency that I had. Now regarding the weapon, I'm not sure lightning damage was the right choice. It does make Trinity easier to proc, but lightning has a really wide damage range. And the way this skill works on single target is when you trigger that explosion on your 6th hit, the explosion is based around the damage that you do on that 6th hit to trigger it. So if you roll really low on lightning, you'll hardly notice the difference. If you get lucky and roll really high, you're going to see that health bar chunk. That's kind of evident in the Maven footage earlier on, which I'll show again. You can see the first time I hit the 6th hit, there's a big chunk of Maven's life go down, but the second 6 hits, you hardly notice any difference in the drop, and that's purely going to be down to lightning damage rolling. Now, there are other things that can affect that, like chance to deal double damage, but overall, lightning does make it a bit more RNG on that explosion hit, but shock should make up for that. So I am going to stick with lightning, but I'm not sure whether something like cold and fire combined would be better. What I'm probably going to look to do for this character to get some cheap and easy damage is get an interrogation cluster jewel, get a sword with big fire and cold damage, because that means that I can get big brittle on an enemy and big scorch. I can then drop precise technique, go crit, and it's going to ramp the damage up, but I haven't decided what I want to build the character yet, so that's for a future video. From here, it was really just a case of completing maps as quickly as I could. The content at this point was absolutely trivial, but because it's on a new account, I don't have an option of just running yellow or red maps. I have to run the maps that drop. Once at level 78, I added a perseverance belt to the build. We're not stacking armor and evasion in any way, so the added damage aspect doesn't do that much, but free onslaught just feels really good for map clear, especially early on when you don't have a ton of mobility. I will probably get rid of it at some point because I don't think I want to go the armor and evasion route on this character. But again, I don't know what the end goal for this character is at the moment. So I decided to spend a little bit extra than the 1C and spent 5 chaos getting one that had max life and big cold resistance. I added some attack speed crafts to my gloves for another 2 chaos. So at this point, my spend was 12 chaos. After recording the footage that you've seen in the background, I then decided to roll some Eldritch Implicits on my gear, because you can get like 7 to 10 of them for a chaos. So I spent 5C on Icors and Embers, and rolled some Implicits on my gear that definitely help. I don't plan on making any more upgrades until I notice that I'm starting to struggle with the content at the moment. It's a breeze. I don't feel like I'm dying. I don't feel like I'm not killing stuff quick enough. So there's no point making improvements until I really need to. So with kind of the character progress out the way, I will go over the character really quickly later on, just in terms of the skill links, all the gear and stuff you can have a look at in the POB. What I want to do now is go through how I'm actually making money, because most of the stuff that drops is worthless. And what I've settled on is Delirium, because it's very, very easy to just get a 100% chance for a Delirium mirror to spawn. They seem pretty common on the idols that drop, and in the first 10 maps, I've already got a 100% chance for a Deli mirror to spawn. The reason for that is you get random rewards, which can sometimes be the odd bit of useful currency or maps. Lots of things that can help me on limited currency, but it'll also drop Delirium orbs, and they actually sell pretty decently on the exchange. They go from like 6C up to 10C, can be even more if you get some of the more expensive ones to drop. Doesn't really add any time to my map. I just run through the mirror. Whenever the fog runs out, it runs out. If there's Deli orbs at the end, I pick them up. There's also some cluster jewel bases that are worth a bit of money, so I'll be on the lookout for those as well. The other thing I think you can make money on early on is scarabs. Now, it's going to be RNG as to what you have drop, but they sell quite well individually if you've got the right one, so you don't necessarily have to stock them up. So what I'm doing at the moment is looking for any idols that drop with increased chance to drop Harbinger scarabs or increased chance to drop ambush scarabs. And then if I get scarabs that are no good, I'll 3-to-1 vendor them and hope that I get one back that's worth some currency. It's going to be bits and bobs. I'm hardly going to make a ton of currency doing it. I've probably made about 30 or 40 chaos in my first 25 maps, but I don't need any currency. What I want to do at the moment is just get through the map tiers, get more of my idol slots unlocked, make sure that I can actually farm efficiently, then I can start earning some currency. One thing you can do if you don't mind heisting is demolition contracts before you hit maps. They are probably more lucrative now than at League Start because how difficult it is to actually earn chaos early on. You could spend an hour in heist, and with the chaos that you get out, you'll be able to deck your character out in gear that's going to crush red maps. I really didn't feel like doing heist, so I just did one to get the currency for my essences and my belt, and then I moved on to mapping. Labyrinth is another good option. You can hunt for gems, but before you do that, always check the market to make sure that there are gems that are actually valuable before you go completing that content, because it isn't the most fun. That's kind of it for the first episode. I've just taken on the first Maven challenge. I should have enough damage on my 5 link to push to red maps, and then we'll move on to a 6 link in the next episode and see maybe what route we want to take the character and whether there's some uniques that have some interactions with the skill that will be really fun. As I said, I'll quickly go through my character in terms of, the gem links that it's got on. The gear is going to be in the POB. I don't necessarily think this is the best way to do it. I've kind of just done this on a whim, but it's worked absolutely fine, and I'm still not really hitting any resistance going into sort of mid-tier yellow maps. I'll just quickly go over the gem links that I've settled on. The gear you can look at in the POB. So I've got Infernal Blow. I've linked that to Trinity, LE damage with attacks, inspiration, and faster attacks. The reason for faster attacks is because I mentioned every time you get that 6th hit on an enemy, there's a massive explosion. The quicker you can get that off, I think your DPS on a single target will be better. It's the same reason that we are running haste as our 50% aura. I could run grace or determination for more defensiveness, or something like anger for more flat damage. But haste I think feels nice when you're mapping for the movement speed, and the attack speed again helps get that 6th hit off. Just got leap slam as our movement skill. Then precision leveled up to as high as I need it to make sure accuracy is above my life. Arctic armor I'm using as my second aura. It's only 25% reservation. Gives us pretty good defenses when we're standing still, and it gives me immunity to freeze. Blood Rage again for attack speed and frenzy charges. Flame Dash as my secondary movement skill, and then I'm also running an Elemental Weakness Curse, which I don't think I've used once because I always forget. There's some things I need to add to the build. I need to add endurance charges, which I'll add in once I do my 4th Labyrinth. Also need to add in some sort of guard skill, but at the moment I don't really have any defenses to boost up, so a guard skill is not really going to be the difference between life and death. Once we start getting endurance charges, then we can get something like a Mortal Call into the build. That's kind of it for the first episode. There will be a detailed POB in the description in case you wanted to follow along. Now I'm going to plow on, do some more maps, and get some footage ready for the second video. Thanks for watching, take care, and see you in the next one.